content is necessary for digital advertising. If you don't have digital content, you don't have a place to run those ads. Have you ever thought about the fact that Facebook and YouTube and Google are all advertising platforms? We might think they're there for our entertainment or education, but the truth is they're there because of and for advertisements. That's the core of their business. They may use user-generated content or search results, but it's all content for advertising. So with the understanding of the importance of content to advertising, it's also important to understand how to work with content creators and the media. It might seem like a no-brainer to some of you, but you might be surprised at some of the fundamentals of those relationships that we might not understand as well as we'd like. So today we're talking with Jim Sexton, who's the Vice President of Digital at B.A.S.S, which is the biggest media company in fishing. And bassmaster.com and all of B.A.S.'s digital content is a big part of the media landscape in the fishing business. Jim oversees all of that, so he knows his stuff. As a bonus to this episode, I've put together a free download for you, the Fishing Business Guide to Working with the Media. You will be able to find the free resource at fishingbusinessschool.com/Sexton. I'll also put the link in the show notes so you can click over to it, or just type in fishingbusinessschool.com/Sexton to download the Fishing Business Guide to Working with the Media. I think it'll be worth your time to look it over. Okay, you with me? I need your attention here on this one, guys. Here we go. It's the Fishing Business Podcast. All right. I'm excited, Jim. I'm very excited to be with you here today. You know, we worked together for probably 10 years, maybe.
Yeah,
and
9, but yeah, close to that.
It was some of the best 10 years of my life. So, and you were a big part of that. It was a really, really talented team at B.A.S, and we had some really good times, I think, and did some really good work. Don't you think?
I agree. I'm really proud of it.
Yeah. You know, we, Jim and I both came to B.A.S shortly after the new ownership group bought it from ESPN, which was Don Logan and Jerry McInnes and Jim Copeland. And at the beginning, it was kind of like the Wild Wild West, wasn't it? We were all just trying to figure things out, right?
It was a very entrepreneurial time.
It was. And that was what made it fun. Well, before we get into things, Jim, let's start by you talking a little bit about your professional background and your path. What brought you to this place? Because I know you've been at a lot of different brands. So how did you get to B.A.S?
Well, I have to start with where I grew up. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, because it's so important to kind of who I am. With a lot of rivers and lakes and mountains around that area, the outdoors was my youth, and I just wanted to be outside. Anything, whether that be hiking, whether that be fishing, whether that be out on the water in a canoe. So started there. I went to school at University of Tennessee, got a journalism degree there, and with the goal of telling stories one way or another, whether that be through pictures or writing, which is where I started. And so my first media job was with a magazine called Best of Business. I was a young, assistant editor doing anything and everything, writing and editing and helping the team figure out which stories to run. Went from there to a health magazine called Special Reports on Health. And then that company went out of business, and I moved my little family to Washington, D.C. and worked at USA Weekend, part of the USA Today world.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I came in, and my beat was health, and then it was country music. They knew I was from Tennessee. And then it was teen-related stories. Worked on a series with the vice president at the time's wife, Tipper Gore, about teens.
Oh, yeah.
And just kind of got into everything there. It was a weekly magazine, so it was kind of fast and furious, a lot of content. But I really wanted to find a way to get back to Knoxville. And there was a new cable network that had started there called HGTV. And I managed to talk my way into getting a job there. It was in the late 90s, and digital media was starting up, and I became the first editor of their website, hgtv.com. And I got to ride that train for 9 years, where that cable network went from just a few homes up to, 100 million homes. And
Golly.
so for a while there, it felt like everything we did worked. I thought I was really smart, but I was part of a broader trend going on there. And the way I got down to Birmingham was Bruce Aiken recruited me to come down and run their lifestyle websites for Time Inc. out of Birmingham. They had Southern Living, Cooking Light, and a bunch of others, a recipe site called My Recipes, and did that, was in Birmingham. And then the recession hit and I got laid off, and I got really lucky or really blessed at that time, because that was about the time that B.A.S.S moved to Birmingham. And so I managed to catch on at B.A.S.S, and here we are 9 years later. And, the fun part about being at B.A.S.S for me is that I do get to still be part of the management team. That's kind of what I have evolved into in my previous jobs. But what's different here is that I get to, and I need to do the fun stuff too. I need to write stories and take pictures and shoot videos and be on podcasts. And so it's a real hands-on job, which, gosh, I wouldn't have it any other way now.
Right. And you're good at it. You're really good at it. I mean, I've seen you work, and was always surprised that you had those skills that made you a good manager, and were able to, manage people and all that. But you were also a very good storyteller, whether it was visually or written, or I don't know about your video skills. I'm not sure that I've seen that, but I'm sure they're probably good.
Pretty basic.
Love that. So what is about the fishing sport that you like, that I know you said you really loved the outdoors growing up? Is that why you feel good here?
Yeah, I mean, I love being outside, and I remember early on at B.A.S.S, I would be at a tournament, and I'd be out on the water with Steve Bowman, and we'd be sitting in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, and it'd be a Thursday afternoon, and I'd look around and go, I'm getting paid to do this.
Yeah.
I'm at work. So that's kind of the core of it. But I love that in fishing, you have to keep learning. And I'm talking about as an angler, and you know this, that you can be pretty good at catching fish on Tuesday with a certain setting and a certain bait or a certain two baits. And then on Wednesday, a cold front moves through, and you really don't know what you're doing now, and you have to relearn and figure it out. And that's true whether you're me or Angie Thompson, or whether you're Rick Clunt.
Right. Ain't it the truth, man?
I mean, whether he's been doing it for a long, long time. So I love the learning part about it. I really love the relationships you develop when you're in the boat with somebody. If you're in the boat with somebody for 4 hours or 8 hours, you're good friends typically by the end of it. And I really love that fishing is a great family activity that is just plain out good for you.
I agree.
It's just got so many pieces to it that I love, and so I'm thrilled to be in it. I feel really blessed.
Well, we talked a little bit about, your role at Bassmaster, but if you had to tell your great grandparents what you do for a living, how would you describe it?
I thought about that. Was a fun question. I think my grandparents would think I'm a tournament angler, because I go to so many tournaments. Because people do that all the time. They're like, "Oh, here comes Jim. He's getting ready to go fish a tournament." And at a certain point, I just kind of go along with it. But I think they would probably latch on to the things they understand, which is, okay, he's a writer or he's a photographer. I think and with my parents, they're in their 80s, so if I explain it to them, they get confused really quick.
Right.
It's funny. The guy that cuts my hair is a 70-something-year-old guy, and I'll go in there and I might complain about something at work, and he'll turn around to anybody that's in the barbershop and go, "This dude's job is to go out and take pictures of fishing. So what is he complaining about?" So but I probably didn't answer your question very well, because what I would try to tell them is I manage the content for bassmaster.com and our social media, and I manage the technology too.
So for our listeners and viewers, when they see Jim Sexton, VP of Digital, really what that means is everything on bassmaster.com and the Bass social media platforms sort of filter up through you, right? You sort of have
That's
your
correct.
hands in all of those pots.
That's exactly right.
And you not only manage the writers and the content creators, but you also manage these freelancers. You manage relationships with anglers. You manage business deals with anglers and with sponsors. Isn't that true?
That's true. And you'll probably touch on this later, but an awful lot of our sponsors have content that makes its way onto the website or that we promote in social. So there's a lot of conversations with sponsors about content.
Yeah.
And on the technology front, with JM that Mike McInnes and that team create the live shows and have people that run our weigh-in streams. And so my role with those guys is really more on the technology front.
Right.
Is making sure we have the right technology to support those endeavors. And that's something that I've evolved into really over the last 20 years of understanding the technology well enough. I'm not going to go in and code the website, but I do understand what we need and what I need to get lined up so that we can do our work.
We don't need you to code the website, Jim. We got plenty of people out there that do that. We need you doing what you're doing. And just to let you all know what Jim was saying there about JM Associates is the production company that I actually worked at for years and years and years and years since I was a little child. And it was founded by Jerry McInnes. His son, Mike McInnes, runs the company now. And it was a television production company that ended up, after the purchase of B.A.S.S by the new group that included Jerry and Don and Jim, they ended up buying JM and folding it into the B.A.S.S family. So they're actually part of B.A.S.S, but still sort of an independent production company based in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And you can't say they do all the television now. Really, you have to say they do most of the video content, wouldn't you say?
Yep, that's accurate.
I mean, we still have video content that other people produce, but JM probably does the lion's share of it.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Before we go to break, I'm going to take a short little break here, Jim. But before we do, what is something about you that people may not know about you?
I'll tell you two things. You might know the first one. When I was in college, I worked in Yellowstone Park for 2 years. And the first year I worked in a tackle store on Lake Yellowstone that sold really primarily what we sold there were lures and fishing gears for that lake, which is in that lake. But
I
also
fished on that lake, and it's awesome.
Oh my gosh, cutthroat trout, yeah. But we also had a big fly fishing counter, so I got to know fly fishing a little bit too. The other one, which I've thought about this a lot over the years, the first 2/3 of my career were really doing lifestyle media for women. Okay? I was actually the editor of a magazine for women. That health magazine was for women. So, and I have a background that set me up for that. I grew up with 3 sisters. I'm the only boy. And our best friends, family-wise, was a family with 4 girls.
Oh.
And so we would go to the beach with the Abbott family, and it would be 7 girls and me. So it kind of came to a head when I went to USA Weekend, where I swear they hired me because I was a man, because they had a primarily female staff, and I may not have been the best candidate, but I was a man.
Right. So, and you could get along with females.
I could get along with females. And so it's very interesting that now I work in a media that is primarily for men.
Yeah.
We don't exclude women, and we want more women to come to Bassmaster, but our existing audience is heavy on the male side.
Yeah, I love that though. That's probably why you and I always got along so well, Jim, is because
that's it.
You know how to work with women and make them feel good about themselves. But I thought you were going to say that your thing that people might not know about you, and I can't remember the exact details, but weren't you part of a performing group in college?
That's people have a lot of. I've told this story, and people take away different things, that I was in the circus or. But my first job, I was essentially called Mr. Science, and I went around and did assembly programs in high schools and junior highs. in the first year was in the Midwest. I went from Chicago down to the Ohio River and really did schools mostly in Indiana. The second year was in New York State and did a few months in New York City, but then a lot of Western and North Central New York. During the fall, spring, and winter, and so it was a performing show at schools. I did that for 2 years.
I think I can see you doing that. And I think I remember seeing or hearing of a part of your presentation where you made your hair stand on end.
Yeah, I'd put my hand on forget what this device was called, but static electricity caused your hair to stand up. And I actually had hair then, but I would typically get a girl or a boy with long hair to go up there to come out of the audience with me, and theirs would be much
That's
more.
great. That's
cool
great.
looking.
I love that. I love that. All right, Jim, we're going to be right back on the Fishing Business Podcast with Jim Sexton, the VP of Digital at B.A.S.S, B-A-S-S. We'll be right back. Hey, if you're enjoying this podcast, check out fishingbusinessschool.com, where you can see video uploads of the podcast, as well as my blog, where I give you more practical advice on the business side of fishing. fishingbusinessschool.com. Come see me over there. All right, we're back on the Fishing Business Podcast with Jim Sexton from B.A.S.S. And Jim, right there at the end of that last segment, you said something that made me think this is a good takeaway for people at home listening. Our listeners and viewers may want to be professional anglers, but they also would love to have a job in the outdoor industry. And what you said there about your first job out of college being Mr. Science, and I think that's kind of informative of how you, especially people just coming out of college, shouldn't get too stressed out about what their very first job is. Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of us that ended up here, when I hear their life stories, their first job didn't seem like it was pointing in this direction.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway, particularly during this time when kids coming out of college in 2020, good grief, what a difficult career environment that is. So for me, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I had a journalism degree and I interviewed at newspapers, and I wasn't having much success getting in the door. I tried both as a photographer and a writer, and I was dismayed at the pay. It was like, I figured it out one time. I interviewed at a newspaper in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and figured out the pay was basically minimum wage. I could have worked at McDonald's and made the same thing. And so I was discouraged, and I stopped by a place called Oak Ridge Associated Universities and just literally walked in the door and said, "Are y'all hiring for anything?" And this very nice lady took me in, sat me down, told me they were hiring for this traveling position where you were going to travel around the country, and was I interested in talking with them about it? And I was like, travel? Gosh, that sounds great. And I ended up, and the other people they hired were like science related people, and somehow they hired me too. And it was a lot of fun. I made friends. It really doesn't have much bearing on what I've done now, except you did have to communicate. You had to get up in front of talk to people and put together a message and find ways to engage an audience, which with high school kids was making them laugh every once in a while.
That's right. I love that. And you're right. You never know what skills you're learning, especially in your first couple of jobs, where that's going to take you, because so much of your first couple of jobs, you're just learning how to work.
Yeah, that's right. And you're figuring out who you are and all those kinds of things. So,
right. And what you like.
Yeah. And don't like.
That's right. So we talked earlier that you've been at brands like HGTV.com and Southern Living and Cooking Light. And these are really, really blue chip brands. How did that inform your decision making now? How does working at those places influence what you do now?
Well, one thing that's really transitioned over well to Bassmaster is that those brands, all of them, are very how-to oriented. They're teaching people how to cook certain recipes, or they're teaching people how to build projects at home, or the Time Inc. brands also had travel components, so they're helping you have the best experience possible on a particular trip by telling you the cool places to eat and the places to go. So the how-to part of it, was something I'd worked on kind of since the beginning, and that transitions well to bass fishing, where you're always in a teaching mode. We do a lot of how-to, whether it's how to fish certain techniques or how to use certain lures or reels or things like that. So I understood the value of how-to, and that was important.
And how important is the how-to content on the Bass platforms? Because I think a lot of people watching this are probably wondering if they should be doing some how-to content in their feeds.
Right. It's really important. I would call it kind of our bread and butter. A how-to story about how to drop shot that we put up on the homepage isn't going to get tens of millions of page views, but it's going to be around for years. And so the search engines are going to pick that up when people search. So I feel like how-to is very important to us. It's of course very seasonal, very geographic specific for some. So there's a lot of how-to cover, and sometimes we do it related to our tournaments. Sometimes we do it more generally related to the season. But I think you're right, for anglers who are wanting to make a career in this sport, teaching people how to fish is the basic, simple thing you can do to engage an audience. And I would also encourage you to think about it in terms of not just people who are at the same level as you, but also teach the beginners.
Right.
My favorite video that I've gotten from an angler during the pandemic was from Bill Lowen. And Bill did a beginner tackle setup on his workbench in his garage, and he very thoroughly and very respectfully goes through and shows how to set up a beginner rod and reel with a bobber, a hook, a lead weight, the right knot to tie, the right baits to use. It's just great. And I think we in the fishing industry forget that there's this whole group of people out there that want to fish, and they need to learn.
Right. I got a call last night from my 23-year-old nephew, where he had gone to or actually was in academy, and was saying, what do I need to buy?
Yeah.
And I'm like, it can be very overwhelming to stand in front of those huge walls of lures and tackle and equipment and try to figure out what you need. The sport is complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, for such a simple sport that ultimately you're just trying to catch a fish, it's complicated, and there's so many options out there.
That's right. That's right.
The other thing I think about transitioning from those previous brands to this one is I kind of learned that there are simple things that the audience wants, and it's not always a big bang kind of cool idea. At HGTV, we figured out pretty quickly that when people watched those shows, one thing they wanted was, tell me the brand of the products that you have shown in that show. So what's the couch? What are the drapes? What is the sink? What is the faucet? Those kind of things. So for literally every show that was on the network, we had a page on the website that listed every single product. It was not a pretty page. It was not super cool. It just was a list, and those were the most viewed pages on the website in my early years.
I bet.
So we do some similar things with Bassmaster for the winners of tournaments.
So talk a little bit about the process of how you get a story published from concept to, sort of getting it online, working with the writer or the content creator, and then also how you measure, how well it does.
Sure. The concept for stories, I would say, come from three places. All right. One is, we're here in the office. We think about Bassmaster and our tournaments and our anglers all day long. And so somebody will say, maybe me, and we say, hey, we need to catch up with the AOI leader. It's a third of the way through the season, and we need to do a story on that person. what they're thinking, how their season's going, how they're feeling about the rest of the year, and we would assign that to someone. Could be a story or could be a video. So concept-wise, it can work that way. It can also work where a freelance writer or videographer calls in and says, hey, I've got an idea. And I was thinking of one that was recent where Steve Wright, who you know in Little Rock or in Arkansas, had an idea for a story about Scott Rook, the retired elite angler, and he had stopped by the store that Scott Rook manages and outside Little Rock, I guess. I think it's called Southern Outdoors.
Yep, Southern Reel Outfitters.
Southern Reel, yeah, there you go. So he'd had a conversation with Scott, and it was partially a story about catching up on what he's doing, but it also became a story about what are the most popular questions people ask him in his store as manager of a fishing store.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was some great little insights that came out. So anyway, that was a pitch from a writer. The third way is that an angler will mention something. Might be a story pitch, but it also may just be in a conversation. And I'll tell you a specific story. I talked to Jason Williamson, lead angler Jason Williamson, last week, something related to one of his sponsors. He had a new sponsor. But in the course of the conversation, I said, so how you doing? You know, what's going on? And he said, well, man, my son is graduating from high school this Friday. I'm really proud of him. He got a full ride scholarship, fishing scholarship to Erskine College. Well, there's a story.
Wow.
You know, the son of a lead angler who's going to college on a full ride fishing scholarship. That's interesting. So story ideas come from a lot of sources. It might come from a sponsor as well. But anyway, that's the beginning part. That sometimes takes the most time. Then they write it, or we shoot it, or we send a photographer. The content gets done. It comes in-house. We have myself or two or three other people who will edit it and then publish it, which is put it into our content management system. It's basically you work in various buckets to put the text in, to put the photo in, to put the headline in. And thought goes into the headline because you want it to get people's attention. And I kind of, when I struggle for a headline, I think, what's the most interesting thing in this story? Because that's what people want to know about. So get a good headline on it and then hit publish. And we determine where it goes. Does it go on the homepage or a category page? How high up does it go? How low does it go? And then does it go into social media also? So once all that is done, you asked about the metrics. We use a couple of systems. One's called Adobe Site Catalyst, and we also use Google Analytics, and we check to see how that story or video performed, how many people clicked on it. It's almost like birthing a baby. You put it out there and then you see what happens. And so, you know, we see how many people opened that story. And that gives you a sense of whether that topic was as good as you thought it was.
Now, I have to ask this. Is the number of views or the impressions that content or story get, is it the be all end all for what kind of content you want to put on your platforms?
I like that question because it's not. I'll give you an example. We do conservation content, and it's not always the most consumed, but it's important to the Bass brand. It's important to who we are. Some of the beginner topics that I mentioned earlier, those aren't going to perform as well as the man cave photo gallery we did about Gary Klaus last week, because he's a well-known guy. He's the president of Phoenix Boats, or CEO. That blew up. It did great. The story about, you don't know how to fish, where should you go, isn't going to do that well because it's just a lot of our audience right now already knows how to fish, so it's not going to perform well. So I think there's kind of two categories. One is, for our business to do well, we need content that a lot of people like. All right. That's what advertisers want to be in. But we're looking at furthering the sport, furthering who Bassmaster is as a brand, and all of those things aren't going to perform well initially. So we try to do both and do a fair amount of both.
I love that. You know, my mentor at ESPN was a man named Bill Fitz, and he had been around forever and had done everything there was to do in sports TV, including, you know, he directed the very first Super Bowl and a lot of accolades. He's in the Sports Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and he told me one time, he said, Angie, you cannot get too caught up in ratings, because ratings aren't everything. They're important, but really there's somebody else's job to figure out. Our job is to tell good stories and to tell the right stories for the ESPN brand, right?
Right.
And but then on the other hand, you know, there were other people there that would also say at ESPN that would also say, until you go to work for PBS, public broadcasting, we do have to care about ratings.
Yeah.
We do have to care about the business side.
Yeah. And one piece of that for us is on the website and in social is, if we only cared about the numbers, then we really only do content about the superstar anglers in the sport. Right? Because they're superstars. People already know who they are. They like them. They want to click on the content about them. We know that. But we have an obligation to the rest of the elite field and the opens and the college tournaments and the high school tournaments to tell those stories too, because they deserve attention. They have good stories that need to be teased out. So anyway, that supports what you're saying.
Got it. Yep. Got it. I agree. Okay. What do you, in your mind, if you could distill it down, because this is a very, very complicated question, but if you could distill it down, what does make good content?
I like thinking about that. It could be a giant answer, but I wrote down a few things that, because I think you kind of got to simplify it. But on the basic front, it is, does this help the audience, an angler who's reading this, become a better fisherman? Okay. For Bassmaster, that's one definition of what is good content. We need to help people catch fish, catch bigger fish, that kind of thing. So thinking more on the how-to and gear side, and even on the tournament coverage side, that's a definition. And you know that with our live show, part of the goal of that show and part of what people get out of it is learning how to fish and learning how to fish certain techniques in certain locations. So it's not just entertainment. It's also, does it help the audience become a better fisherman? But that's kind of, you know, that's, put that off to one side because that's pretty definable. What makes good content, I think, is there some drama or intrigue? That's good for tournament coverage. But after that, is it interesting? Is it compelling? Maybe is it compelling even to people who don't fish? Okay. Ultimately, I think about that some, because if it's interesting on a human level to people who don't fish, it's going to be interesting to people who do fish, because we're running it on Bassmaster and it's about an angler. So I think my definition is pretty simple, and I remind myself sometimes that if you haven't been doing content for 30 years like I've been doing, that doesn't necessarily make sense. But if you're a curious person, if you're interested in a lot of things, does this story appeal to you? Does this video appeal to you? And so on a human level, it could tease your heartstrings, it could entertain you, it could make you laugh, it could inspire you a little bit. You know, I find that the backgrounds of a lot of our anglers are inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I answered that well enough for you or not, but
I think you did. I think it's good for people to kind of think through that. All of us really that are in this business, and you know, content is everything from a very well written, award-winning article in Bassmaster magazine to something that you put on your social media. It's all content out there, and so we all need to think that through, I think, in our minds of what is good.
I think for young anglers or people trying to break into the sport, defining what's interesting in your life to other people is an important part of doing well with the media. And
Well,
that can,
let's talk about that.
that,
Why is it important?
well, it's important because you're probably, unless you're the greatest angler of all time, you're probably not going to be able to make a living fishing tournaments alone. There's an awful lot of people trying to win those tournaments. So, if you're Hank Cherry this year and you win the Classic and it's got a $300,000 payday, you can make a living this year just fishing.
Yeah.
If you're Paul Mueller and you won the St. John's tournament, you got $100,000 check, you can have a pretty good year. But for most people, that's a rare thing to win a big tournament like that. So you need fans. You need people to know who you are. And whether those be actual fans or whether they be sponsors, you need to be out there so that you are seen and known by fans and sponsors. And the media is your fastest path to that.
Right. And that's why it's really important that you develop a good relationship with the media. And
Exactly.
most of the anglers that we work with on the elite level understood that and were, super easy to work with. But there were, there's always people that don't understand that the media
Right.
ultimately is there to try to help them.
That's right.
In our sport anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
So but for people that are, again, coming up that may not understand this, listen, I remember when we started, I was involved with the team that started the FLW tour back in, golly, ancient history time. And I can remember working with people who were very distrustful of having a camera in the boat because they didn't want people to see what they were doing. And it was a big transition to get some people to understand that we were there to help and we were there to tell stories. And so for people coming up and just getting started, what are some of the best practices that they should have and practice about working with the media?
I think one basic one is that you need to develop relationships with the media. All right. Just as if you're trying to get a sponsor to sponsor you, and whether that's an auto body shop or whether that's Rapala, you have to develop relationships and get to know those people. They're not going to spend money with you just because you're a nice guy and they saw that you won a tournament by itself. So you have to develop relationships. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to give you a couple of examples that that are regional. Andy Crawford is one of our photographers and writers. He lives in Louisiana. Andy and these anglers have developed a relationship. Derek Hudnall, Quentin Capo, Tyler Rivette, Tyler Carrier, all those guys live near Andy. So because they have a relationship and they've gotten to know each other over the last couple of years, Andy will go out and do content with them. And I know that I can hire Andy to go do content with them without sending him all over the country. He doesn't have to get on an airplane. He can just drive an hour and be with each one of these guys. So,
and get good content.
And get good content because he's a good content creator. So that scenario happens throughout our business here. Craig Lamb is in Nashville. He can get to Brandon Lester quickly, and Carl Jochimson and Brandon Card. So those developing relationships with content people, whether that be a local news reporter from a newspaper or from a TV station or something like that, I think sometimes that's as simple as talking to them, acknowledging them, showing them that they're important and that you respect them and care about them, or inviting them on a fishing trip.
I was going to say, take them fishing, man.
I mean, that's the easiest path. Who doesn't want to go fishing with somebody who's a professional angler?
That's right.
So that's one best practice. That's a big one. I think the other, and not everybody is a big talker, right?
I wouldn't know anything about that, Jim.
So, but I think when you're talking with media, you need to learn how to tell a story. All right. And that story can be about the tournament, but it can also be about something going on in your family or your father or your wife or girlfriend or something interesting you've done in your past. Being comfortable with telling a story about yourself is important, because that's what those media people remember.
Right.
You may have won that tournament, but if you also mentioned that growing up, your father was in the military and you lived all over the world, then they're like, oh, wow, okay, I've got something interesting to dive into here. So finding something that's kind of interesting, or you got a college degree in biology, or in high school you were the offensive lineman for your football team. Anything to help them get to know you as a person helps them remember you.
I'm going to interrupt you one second here, because I think this is really an important distinction. And I remember an Elite Series pro in his rookie year, me talking to him, and I honestly can't remember why this subject came up, but the two of us were talking, and I said, you have to figure out what your story is. What is your story? And he was like, I don't have a story.
Right.
He's like, there's nothing interesting about I don't have a story. Well, as it turns out, he had gone and worked in Iraq for a couple of years to try to get, to save up money and to qualify for it was an incredible story. And I'm like, why, I think sometimes we tend to think our lives are just boring, run of the mill. And so how does a guy figure out what his story is and if it's interesting?
I think you could sit down with a friend and just say, let me tell you my life story, and you write down anything that you find interesting.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. The story you just told is a great example. I believe that every human being has an interesting story in some form or fashion. It doesn't mean that they were a superstar or that they started a business or they did something amazing. There's something interesting. They may love to grow blueberries, or they may have good skills being an auto mechanic. There's just, or something from their parents. Everybody's life story has something that is compelling and interesting. And so that'd be one way to do it. You could write them down yourself. You could run them by somebody else and sort of test them out and say, what do you find interesting out of this? And ask that friend to ask you questions, follow-up questions.
It's a great idea. That's great advice. I love that. So what else? Do you have any more tidbits for us, tips on working with the media?
I think the other thing that can be helpful is, what are the areas in your life that you're passionate about? Is it helping underprivileged kids? Is it the Asian carp on the Ohio and Mississippi and Tennessee River? I mentioned that one because Mark Menendez, one of our lead anglers, he's a fisheries biologist, and that's something that he's very passionate about. So anytime we need anything related to that, we go to Mark Menendez. But I think teasing out a few of the passions in your life, that's another angle that writers and videographers like to know about. I remember a video that JM did a few years ago about one of our Louisiana anglers. Now I'm forgetting his name, but he raised cattle.
So, yeah.
Here we have a guy pursuing a professional fishing career, and he raises cattle too, and that's pretty interesting.
Absolutely, I love that. So when you are talking with the media or working with them or getting interviewed or doing a story, do you think there's a conscious, a guy should or a girl should make a conscious effort to shift their mindset from, sort of a competition mode to an interview mode, especially at a tournament?
Right. Yeah, I think you have to slow down a little bit, take a deep breath, and be able to tell the story of your day, and weave in a few details that keep it interesting. Showing the excitement and the passion and the breathlessness of your day. Let's say you had a terrible day, and in the last hour you caught 7 big fish and were able to cull up to 28 pounds. The reporter or the videographer seeing your excitement there is not a bad thing. It's just you probably need to go into a little more detail and be able to do it more than just with hand symbols, and then be able to tell that story. So I think as much as anything, it's just take a deep breath, slow down, and really tell the whole thing.
I'm going to tell a quick story and tell on Steve Kennedy. But when Steve first started at B.A.S., he was an engineering major, and Steve has a a very definite way of looking at things, and I love him like a brother, so I feel okay about saying this, but he's pretty black and white about a lot of things. And at the time, I was gathering some content for the digital team at tournaments where I would do these little anecdotes. I can't remember what they were called, but it was kind of like overheard, at the tournament. And I would try to get information out of Steve, and he would just never give me anything. I would go up to talk to him, and he just kind of would never. So I went to Julia, his wife, who is a good friend of mine, and I told her, I was like, what am I doing wrong? I can't ever get Steve. And she was like, oh, he doesn't realize you're trying to interview him. She was like, let me talk to him. So she comes back. She says, listen, I had a conversation with Steve last night. I told him, anytime anybody comes up to you and they're holding a pad and a paper, consider yourself being interviewed.
Yeah. That's great. And that makes me think about, I think one thing that anglers one of the basic things they have to realize is that people working in the media, the writer, photographer, the videographer, it's their job to interview you, to get the story out so that the fans can read it. That's their job. If your job is to catch 5 good fish in a day, theirs might be to shoot 5 videos. So they want to work with you. They want to help you. They'll, if you ask them even and say, I don't know what to talk about, they're not going to write that down in the story, but they're going to try to help you succeed in that interview, because if you do well, they've done well, they get to stay employed and work another day.
And along those same lines, Jim, talk a little bit about why it's important to follow up. If you get called, I know a lot of people will get called about an interview, like, I'd like to do a story with you, or I'd like to talk to you about what happened today. I'd like to just do a quick phone interview. Why is it important to call them back quickly? Talk about that whole process.
Well, it's a really important topic because it tends to be problematic with anglers, where, I can't tell you the 100 conversations I've had with freelance writers and videographers where I say, where's the story? And you told me you'd have it to me today. And they say, well, I can't get the guy to call me back.
Isn't it shocking?
So it is. And, I think if you're fishing for a living, you may be out on the water. You may be in a tournament. You may be focused on doing whatever you're doing. But if you don't get back to that content person, then they move on and interview somebody else because they've got a deadline. They make their stories have to be done by a certain time, or they don't get paid. And so you got to get back to them quick, even if that's, hey, I'm calling you back. I'm in the middle of something that's going to take me all day. Is it okay if I call you tonight?
Right.
So I think that's really important. And so many of the anglers I work with tend to work best via text. Okay. I got their phone with them at all times. If you text them, they can give a quick response. But if somebody calls you and leaves a message, definitely get back. If you're not a user of email, if you don't use email much, start paying attention to your email, because that's another one where, I was talking to one of the top end professional anglers last week, and his wife says he doesn't even know how to use email. And if you're starting out, you got to be good at those things too.
Right. I want to tell another quick story, but this time I'm not going to tell you who it is. But I used to produce this show for ESPN called Bassmaster University, and it was a how-to bass fish how-to show that aired on Saturday mornings. And it was a great time slot that got really great ratings. It was a terrific show, and we used pro anglers. And when you think about this, Jim, these were opportunities for these pro anglers to show their sponsor's product in use and how to use it, and on ESPN. And it was a huge opportunity. And one very, very well-known angler, I asked him we would sometimes shoot at the tournaments. So if someone got cut and they weren't going to be fishing on a Saturday, I would say, hey, can you come shoot this little segment with me for Bassmaster University? We'll meet at such and such place, and I'll have the camera crew there, and we can knock it out in 30 minutes. You show me how to set up this reel. And one very, as I said, very well-known angler, we agreed to meet at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, and he was an hour late. And I was astonished. I'm like, this is the ultimate for your relationship with your sponsor. It's the ultimate thing you can do for them. And
Right.
why you would be an hour late, it just blows me away. And it wasn't that I had to have I had to file a story, but for me, it was, I have the camera guys from 9
Yeah.
until 11, and that's it. They got to go do something else.
Right.
So, and I have other things lined up to shoot at 10, so.
Yeah. I'll just add to that. I think if you're a young angler wanting to break into the business, if you can be good at working with the media and you are responsive and you stay in touch, you can stand out. Okay. Because there's an awful lot of anglers, even at the top of the sport, who don't prioritize it. They think, I got to fish, I got to work with my sponsors. Okay. The media, yeah, I'll do it when I got time. But I think if you can do a great job on this front, on the media front, you can stand out.
That's great advice. That's great advice. Now, one more quick question though. Is it okay if someone calls you and says, "Hey, I'm doing a story about such and such. I wanted to get a quote from you," or is it okay to say, "Can I think about that and call you back in an hour?"
Yes, I think that's great. Actually, I mean, for me personally, you sent me questions ahead of time, and I'm really glad you did, because I like to think about things. I like to kind of think about it. I might be better uh, if I've got a little time to think about it than if it's completely on the fly. So I think that is fine. Just
Right.
do follow up.
Just make sure you
call 'em back.
dang sure you follow
But,
up
you know,
on when you said you would.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if they ask you a question about something that you're just okay on the answer, and you actually do want to spend a few minutes thinking about it, I think it's great to do it that way.
Okay, should anglers pitch? Should they pitch stories to you? And if they should, how should they pitch?
Absolutely, yes. Great idea to pitch ideas. I think in a best case scenario, if you've got a relationship with a writer or producer or something like that, you just drop them an email or drop them a text or call them up and say, I have an idea of something that might be a good story for you. Uh, and I'll tell you, during the pandemic, which we kind of shut down in late March, and so I've had 3 months of a lot less content than I'm used to dealing with. And we have a few of our anglers who have pitched ideas during that time. And I got to tell you, I was hungry to hear their ideas, and there were some really good ones. So pitching is a good idea. It's a really good idea. It doesn't mean they're always going to say yes, but that's okay. That's okay. They're probably going to appreciate the fact that you called. I think just don't wear it out. Don't call them twice a day. But I don't think any of our listeners would go that path. But pitching ideas is great, whether it be how to or interesting personal stories.
Or what's trending and what's new. I can tell you, as a former television producer, content creators, writers, photographers, videographers, producers, we are always looking for good ideas. Everybody is looking for
Yeah.
good ideas. So,
Yeah.
and like you said, we may not want to do every idea, but hearing about it. Here's another example about what's trending. If someone called you and said, you know what, there are a lot of guys are using this new umbrella rig, and
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks later, someone else says, I'm hearing a lot about this umbrella rig. Pretty soon you start going, we need to do a story about the umbrella rig, and Angie told me about it. I'm gonna call her.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example, and I think pitching is fantastic in the fishing media world. Whether it be magazines or websites or TV shows, pitching ideas is fantastic. And the more you can develop relationships with people in the industry, the more open they're going to be to hearing your ideas.
And also your local sports writer, or your local outdoor writer in your town, in your region, in your state.
Right.
Okay, who is somebody, Jim, not a big superstar, we're not talking about Brandon, but who is somebody that you think is doing it right in terms of developing their relationships with the media and what are they doing that you think is right?
Well, I've got a few. I mentioned during the pandemic we had people sending ideas and actually sending content in, and so this is more. These guys I'm going to mention have been doing some content on their own and sending it to us to see if we want to publish it. They're doing it for their own channels, their own YouTube and their own Facebook and that kind of thing. So I've seen some really good work. Jeff Gustafson, the Canadian angler, talk about unique. He's a Canadian angler fishing in the U.S. He's got videos about ice fishing and what they're doing up north. Pretty dang interesting for those of us that live below Canada, particularly in the South where we really never ice fished. Gussie's done some good work. Chad Pipkin's done some fun things. He got a new baby. So, some of the things he has sent in video wise were like his exercise routine with the baby. That was a lot of fun. Drew Benton and Drew Cook are working on a video series. They've got a videographer they've hired. So they're doing some interesting things. Destin DeMarion's a rookie. He sent us some interesting things. So those guys, those are guys that are doing content and looping us in on it and saying, do you want it? And a lot of times the answer is yes. So that's kind of best case scenario. You've produced it in a way that you like, and then we've run it. So I'll tell you a couple other, people who are doing it right. Brian Latimer on the Opens. Brian Latimer works well with media, does a lot of content. Chris and Trade Zaldane doing a lot of content. They work really well with the media. I mentioned Bill Lowen. Bill, gosh, based on that video and 2 or 3 others he's done, I want to work with him more on that kind of topic. He's got young kids.
Love Bill.
Yeah. A couple of rookies that I've seen this year who have been easy to work with and have interesting backgrounds. Wes Logan, he lives in Springville, Alabama. He's produced some videos that I thought were great and worked with some of our writers. He's been good to work with. Kyle Welcher, another rookie. Got to have one of the more fascinating backstories of any of our rookies. He gambled professionally for a living for a while.
Oh my gosh, I did not know that.
Took a year off from fishing to go to Vegas and save some money. So Kyle's been great to work with and is doing some interesting content, and I could see him making a name for himself. So I've probably missed a lot of guys, which sorry about that, but I think there's a lot of good examples of guys who are stepping up, reaching out. They start to understand eventually that for them to succeed, they have to show up on our platforms.
Right. What's your best advice on how to handle, it doesn't happen a lot in our sport, but what's your best advice on how to handle controversy?
Well, I thought about it a couple ways. If you've made a mistake, let's say you got DQ'd for something, and I think about Derek Hudnall last year. He got DQ'd for he practiced on a day when it was off limits, and he realized it. He called in, he turned himself in, and he owned it. All right. He owned it. He said, I screwed up. He didn't try to blame Bass or call it a stupid rule or something like that. And then he actually came to the tournament and served as one of our media boat drivers. So I think if it's a mistake you've made, owning it, that's what we all like to see from the people who we know and work with. If it's a national controversy, of which we have quite a few going on right now, I think before you weigh the ramifications, that what's your sponsor going to think? What are your fans going to think? And then really, if it's something that's very important to you and part of who you are, I think as long as you're respectful and kind and humble about your position and not angry, you can weigh in on some controversial stuff, but it's a little dangerous. I think you got to do it very thoughtfully. Don't just fly off the handle and start posting things in social that are your point of view. Have a neutral source, a spouse or a girlfriend or a friend, give you feedback before you jump on that train.
Or your mama.
Or your mama.
Ask your mama. She'll tell
That's
you.
always good advice.
Hey, what lights you up right now? What lights you up in the business or the marketing or the content world? What are you excited about?
Well, I've touched on a little bit of it. I think anglers doing content on their own, taking the bull by the horns and controlling their own destiny a little bit, I think is a great trend. We've got some great content producers that are emerging, whether that be, you mentioned Brandon Palaniuk, Gerald Swindle. I've talked about Bill Lowen and some others. I think that's a cool trend. And I think, with the advent of these devices, the phones, everybody's a content creator. So getting good at it is good. The other piece of that is all these brands that we work with, they're doing content now. And some of it's pretty good. So I think those two trends are pretty darn interesting.
Love that. Before we go to break here, I do want to say one more thing. Earlier in the conversation, a lot of topics tend to come back again and again and again on this podcast, and one of them has been content. And Johnny Schultz talked about, if you haven't watched the episode with Johnny Schultz talking about his YouTube, we talked about Brian Latimer some, and we really talked about what you just said about how really kind of everybody has access now to be a producer, and you can produce your own content. You don't have to have the $5,000 camera to do it with either. You can do it with, like you said, you can do it with your phone.
Yeah.
And Brian Latimer did it with his phone up until just recently. He'd done a lot of content with his phone. So that's a trend we hear a lot, and I hope everybody really takes that seriously. It's a key thing. The other thing that comes back again and again is relationships. And we started this conversation talking about your first job being not what you ended up doing, but I imagine it helped you inform your decisions and how you got set on this path, and it probably involves some relationships. You have college-age children. I have college-age children and college-age people in my life. You have college-age people in your life. And don't you think that what we've talked about there as it relates to relationships is not just in the fishing world?
Oh, no, it's the whole deal. Yeah, it really is. And there's a kind of a trite saying about finding a job. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And that bothers me a little bit, because that means you have to know people to find a job. And sometimes that's hard. My daughter's looking for a job right now, and it's a hard time to be looking for work. And she's frustrated because she doesn't have necessarily the connections in the field that she has. So, but that said, all you can do is work on that. If you don't have them now, start looking for ways to work on it. And that may be the owner of your local tackle shop. That may be a friend of the family or anything like that. So
you know what? It also might be the media, because if I'm a sponsor and I'm trying to figure out who can I start working with, a good person to ask is a writer who covers tournament fishing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great thought.
All right, Jim, is there something, we're going to take another break here, but before we do, is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't?
I can't think of it, Angie. I was going to say the content needs, well, let me give you one thing.
All righty.
We talked about the sponsors developing content. Okay. A lot of them are doing it. A lot of them are doing it really well. They've hired people that work at most of the big companies, and even the small ones too, have writers and videographers on staff. So as an angler, if you're thinking about how to engage with media, part of that is working with the media people at your sponsors. And that, I think that's going to be more and more true. Even for small local companies, they're going to know of a writer or a videographer, and they're going to send them to you and say, I want you to work on this video with him or her. And so that's a new wrinkle that's out there now. It's not just media people like me who are in media organizations. It's the media people at sponsors. And that's your bread and butter right there.
That's right. Another important relationship to maintain.
Yeah.
We're going to be right back. Take another quick break, and we'll be back with Jim Sexton from B.A.S.S.
I
really want to hear from you to know what kind of questions you have and how I can serve you best in this podcast. The easiest place to reach me is probably at Facebook or Instagram, where you can find me as Fishing Business Podcast, or on YouTube, but you'll have to search for me there by typing in Fishing Business Podcast. Holla! All right, we're back on the Fishing Business Podcast with Jim Sexton, the VP of Digital at B.A.S.S, B.A.S S, the Bass Angler Sportsman Society. Jim, before we go here, a couple of quick little things. Actually, before I say this, I do want to remind everybody that I'm going to have a freebie for you to download here at this URL. I haven't decided what it is yet, but it'll probably be fishingbusinessschool.com/Sexton, SEXTON. That's where I'll put it so that people can download it there. But how does a newcomer stand out? How does somebody new to the sport or new to the industry get the attention of someone like you?
First and foremost, be a good angler, do well in tournaments. You can't ignore that. That's certainly important, but that doesn't mean everybody that we cover is winning tournaments. If so, we'd only have, a few dozen stories a year. So I think after that, it's getting our attention with something about you. Okay. We talked about this earlier, but find the things about you that people find interesting. All right. It doesn't have to be something super sexy. Our angler that's from Upper Wisconsin has a business as a tile setter. That's interesting to me. I like that because it's, he's a real working dude who's trying to make a living in fishing. That's interesting. And there's a whole audience. And I know in my job, there's a whole audience of people like him who would like to do the same thing. So find those interesting things out about you. The other that we've talked about, be prompt, follow up, make return phone calls. Again, if you do those well, if you're a good follow-up person, if you're a good detail person and you answer calls, you will stand out. All right. It's amazing how many people don't do that well. So that's the easy thing. Do the easy thing first.
Man, it's low-hanging fruit. It is low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Jim, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I know you've got a lot to do, and I appreciate you spending the hour with me and with us. And I hope we can do it again sometime.
I look forward to it, Angie. It's been a pleasure.
Jim Sexton is a veteran of the media industry and a real asset to the fishing business. And we're lucky we got a chance to pick his brain today. Don't forget now to download the Fishing Business Guide to Working with the Media at fishingbusinessschool.com/Sexton, SEXTON. I'll put a link in the show notes here so you can head on over and download this free resource. This episode focused heavily on content and particularly video content. If you haven't watched the Fishing Business Podcast with Johnny Schultz from a few weeks ago, you should definitely go back and check that out. It's all about developing video content, and there's a free download with that episode too. Angie and Johnny's list, which is a list of our top tools and tips for creating good videos. It's a good resource for you, and it's free. I'm loading y'all up with free resources. So please take advantage of it. That's it for this week's show. You heard us talking here about JM, the company that's the production arm of B.A.S S, and where I spent a large part of my career as a television producer. Well, JM is named for Jerry McInnes, and I'm going to close things out the way JM always closed his television show, The Fishing Hole, by dedicating this to Dad. He always had time to take me fishing. Thanks, y'all.